Welcome back, everybody. Today, in part three of our scoping conversation, what is CMMC scoping? We're going to talk about the type of assets. What is a controlled, unclassified, or CUI asset? I'm Mark Hateman, president of CUI Solutions, and I have our founder, Amira Armond, on the video here with me, and I'm going to pass it over to her to pick up all things asset.
Woohoo. Thank you, Mark. So I've got the CMMC scoping guide for level 2 here. This is available from the Chief Information Officer, U.S. Department of Defense website, dodcio.defense.gov. You can download it. And in this scoping guide, we break out in scope assets, the ones that need to be secured or assessed in some way, into 4 different groups. So we have CUI assets, security protection assets, contractor risk managed assets, and specialized assets. And stuff that doesn't fit into these groups are considered out of scope, and you don't need to do security for them. All right, so let's review. Let's talk about CUI assets first. So CUI assets are defined as assets that process, store, or transmit CUI. And that's a really straightforward, it's a dangerously straightforward statement. So what does process, store, and transmit mean? Luckily, the scoping guide talks about that for us. So process says CUI can be used by an asset. For example, accessed, entered, edited, generated, manipulated, or printed. Now, so this is a highly technical item that I'm going to bring up. Can be is a problematic set of words. Highly problematic, right? There's lots of stuff that can do something.
It really lacks any clear direction.
There's a lot less stuff that actually is doing something. And these words can be used by an asset, have been in the scoping guide since the beginning of CMMC, and it's always been a problem. Now, this is the final version, the 2024 version that came out with the CMMC final rule. And what I saw is that in level 1 and in level 3 of the CMMC scoping guide. So there's 3 different scoping guides, right? One for each level. There's level 1, 2, and 3. In level 1 and 3, the DoD changed these words to is used by an asset. And I believe that they forgot, not on purpose, I believe it was simply too many editors. They forgot to change it here. So we got clarification on level 1 and 3, but we still have a problem here. But to the best of my understanding, this is an editing mistake, okay? And historically, pretty much all assessors have been treating this as CUI is used by an asset to determine whether something's processing. Right? They are accessing the data. They are editing the data. Not you could potentially get the data.
So I think you're saying that it's likely that most assessors will continue to read that as is used by an asset.
I think so. Now, technically, I'm never going to recommend doing anything other than what the official guidance says.
Right.
But this scoping guide doesn't work real well if you go with could be as opposed to is. And later on, we're going to, in like part 5 or 6 of this series, we're going to talk about something called a contractor risk managed asset, which is defined by can, but is not currently. Right. And so that's that's a much better use of this can be scenarios to call it a contractor risk managed asset. Anyways, so processing. Okay, what are examples of processing? If you're a computer, opening a file into active memory and displaying the contents on the screen with the rendering and graphics capability and CPU stuff or video card stuff, that's all considered processing. If you are a person looking at CUI schematics and reading them with your eyes is considered processing. More obscure versions of processing would be if an antivirus program read a file that had CUI, it's scanning it to see if there's malware, but in the middle of scanning it, it's reading the file. That's processing as well. And there's a common gotcha with scoping where if you have, say, an antivirus server that's separate from your workstation, those antivirus servers might process CUI and you might have something in scope that you didn't expect. Printing is a process. So your printer would be that. For facilities, which is another big category of assets, there's not a whole lot of processing going on. So I can't think of an example of process for a facility. Now, what about opening up a website in a web browser? Is that processing, right? So for example, right here, this file, according to my web browser, is located at defense.gov. So does that mean that my computer is not processing this file? The way web browsers work, right, and this is a generality, but the technology of web browsers is that they will send a request to the web server and they'll say, hey, I need to show a website to my user. And the web server will send across the internet to the browser the pictures, the graphics, the text, and then the code that says how to display it in that browser so it looks cool. And those 3 things come to the local computer, and then the web browser figures out how to display them so it looks awesome on the computer, which means that the local computer is processing. Okay, so this page, for example, this PDF is absolutely being processed by my computer. The fact that I can do this, to me, tells me that I'm processing it in my CPU. Okay. Now, you can have another scenario that's a little bit like the web browser, but it's technically different. So it's called remote desktop or terminal sessions or virtual desktop infrastructure. And those technologies are essentially you connecting to the desktop of some other computer somewhere. And that other computer has its own CPU, it's got its own memory, its own hard drive, all that stuff. And the signals that are passing between your computer and that computer are the video signals. So it's like your computer is the monitor for that other computer. And then you're passing your keyboard and mouse signals. So it's very much like if you had a really, really long set of cords where your screen is plugged into the monitor port on that computer and your keyboard and mouse are plugged into the keyboard and mouse ports on that computer, miles and miles away. Now, in that situation, it's a little bit fuzzy about whether your computer, the one that's locally at your desk, is processing or storing or transmitting CUI. Is that monitor feed considered processing? A lot of people say yes, a lot of people say no. Good news is the DoD has helped us out in the final rule by saying we do not consider that situation to be in scope. Okay, so
Which I'm sure created a whole sigh of relief among not just the companies offering these kinds of solutions, but many enterprise size organizations use VDI or Citrix or one of the remote as a strategy for computing across the enterprise.
100%. It might have been the biggest win of the final rule to get that written clarification. And so essentially the DoD wrote in, if you got a virtual desktop infrastructure type situation, as long as you have blocked the ability to send data through the session, right? So the only thing that you're sending back and forth is the keyboard, mouse, video, right? And you're not able to save the file to your local computer. You're not able to print it. You're not able to copy paste it. Then they say your local computer does not need to be secure at all. It's out of scope, even if you're looking at CUI on the screen through that session. Great win, much easier. Okay. Next, we have store. So store means that so the way I think of it is if you power off that device, if you turn off the electricity, is there still CUI on it, right? Can you still read CUI in it? If you've saved CUI to your hard disk, then you're storing it. If you wrote it onto a piece of paper and you turn off the electricity, paper still exists, you're storing it. So with store, common examples are facilities can store CUI in paper form or in digital form. You can have servers and computers that have hard drives. The IT people always like to bring up that scanners, those multifunction devices, they normally have some sort of a hard drive or memory inside of them that saves images of the scan jobs. But with humans, because humans are assets in CMMC, it's pretty hard for a human to store CUI. I can think of some situations, but they're not common in business. Generally not for humans. Okay. And then next we have transmit. So CUI is being moved from place to place. And that transmission might be being sent from the originator. It might be passing through a middle point. So you could even say that a network cable is transmitting CUI, though generally assessors don't get down to that level. But a switch could certainly be transmitting CUI, a router could certainly be doing it. An email server is actually an excellent example of all three of these, where the server might be processing the email to see whether it matches data loss prevention rules or Whether it has malware in it, it would be storing it on the hard drive so that the user can open up their mailbox and see it later, and that would be transmitting it to get it or to receive it.
And of course, make can also, when you think about people, again, going back to that physical paper, if you've got paper documents, and this is where, policy training, particularly, I think training is important, but that data, that piece of paper, that drawing, whatever it might be, needs to be protected from being transferred from an environment where it's more secure to an environment where it's less secure.
So people can definitely transmit if they're couriering CUI. And then also our digital network capabilities would be considered transmission. Now of note, the DoD generally considers common carrier circuits, meaning your ISP, AT&T, T-Mobile, Verizon, those back-end circuits that connect all the houses together. They consider those to be not accessible. But they do generally want your data to be encrypted before it goes across those third-party pipes. Okay, so now we know what a CUI asset is. It's got CUI on it. And what do we need to do for it? So if we come back to this table here, we have OSA requirements. So OSA stands for Organization Seeking Assessment. That's the defense contractor that is being assessed. And that might be a self-assessment, or it might be they're asking for a third-party assessment. They need to document their CUI assets in the asset inventory. Now, a common question is, do I need to list each one individually? Yes. Simple answer, yeah. You need to be able to figure out if an individual computer or network device or server is part of your asset inventory. And that does involve getting down to the serial number or the computer name, service tag, something like that. Okay. And that's an assessor expectation. Next, you need to document the asset treatment in your system security plan. So what is asset treatment? What that means is, how are you doing all of the applicable requirements to secure this asset? All right, so let's talk about applicable requirements. Remember how we've got computers and network devices and people and facilities? Different requirements in CMMC level 2 are applicable to each one of those things. So we're going to expect that humans are applicable to the training stuff, for example. Train your users on how to properly handle CUI, handle risks to CUI. Your people are applicable to personnel screening requirements. And then your IT people specifically are going to be applicable to stuff like, are they doing change management? Are they doing configuration management? Are they approving or denying the use of software? Now, your computers, your servers, your workstations, the stuff that has like a Linux, Windows operating system, we're going to expect that almost all of the requirements apply, unless they're very specifically for like people or facilities. Okay, so we're not going to try to give cyber awareness training to our Windows computer. But stuff like, controlling communications at that computer or monitoring, activity, we are going to expect those apply to the computer. And then for, facilities, we're going to be checking stuff like, are you controlling access? Are you monitoring, people coming in and out? But we might not check other stuff. So different applicability, and that's totally normal. And we're still doing all of the requirements. We're still doing all 110 requirements. We're just looking at different assets to see if we're doing them properly, right? And it's really a logical call. Your company, if you're a defense contractor and you're in charge of CMMC for that contractor, you get first dibs on saying what is applicable to what. Right? So you should make an attempt to say, I think these things apply to this. I think these things apply to here. And then your assessor is going to double check that for logic, for sanity. Okay. And if you go way too easy on yourself, the assessor is going to say, no. I think that we need to verify this requirement on this type of system too, even though you didn't. And that can get you by surprise. But if you do a good job where you're being reasonable, normally the assessor will say, yeah, that looks good. I agree that we're only going to assess printers against this limited set of requirements, but we're going to assess your Windows computers against a big set of requirements, for example. Now, this conversation about not applicable is different than saying that an entire requirement is not applicable to you at all. You don't have to do it, right? Nothing in your environment has to do with that requirement. That's a pretty significant statement, right? That would be, I don't have to do the wireless requirements. I don't have to do security for wireless. And your justification could be because I don't have wireless. And that's a pretty significant conversation. I'd recommend talking it through with your assessor to see whether they need proof, justification, an email from the DoD CIO, whatever. But what I'm primarily trying to talk about here is that negotiable applicability of individual requirements to individual assets. Okay, so document asset treatment. What this is saying is for each applicable requirement, talk about how you're implementing that security requirement for that type of asset. So in the system security plan, you're going to have 110 requirements, 320 assessment objectives, and in there, you're going to have some that apply to your assets. And so when you have one that, say, applies to a computer, you should address how you do it for that type of computer right there, right? And when you have one that talks, that's applicable to humans, in that you're going to say, for these users, this is how I do this requirement. Next, document in the network diagram of the CMMC assessment scope. So there's an expectation that you, when you're talking to your assessor, you're going to have a network diagram that represents your environment. If you've got physical facilities, you probably want to throw those in too. And you want to show the relationship of that asset to the rest of your network. So is there a big firewall in between it and the other servers? Is it in a demilitarized zone? Is it publicly accessible? Is it in an interior area of the network, right? That's what we want to see here. It doesn't need to be super detailed. You can represent 1,000 laptops with one little laptop icon. That's totally okay. It's representational. It doesn't have to be super detailed. And then finally, prepare to be assessed against CMMC level 2 security requirements. What this is saying is, if it's a CUI asset, then you need to be able to show that you're doing the requirements. Okay, you need to do the requirements.
Have evidence that you're doing the requirements.
Yeah. Okay, and then now we have the CMMC assessment requirements. So this third column was talking to the IT department, the security officer, the CMMC lead for the contractor. And then this fourth column is talking to the assessor, which could be your self-assessor internal to your organization, or it could be a third-party assessor. And it says, assess against all level 2 security requirements for CUI assets. So if you have an asset that processes, stores, or transmits CUI, then the assessors are supposed to verify that all of the security requirements are performed for that type of asset, okay, as applicable. Now, we're almost done. One thing to note is that these other categories, there are overlaps between them. So you can have something that meets the definition of CUI asset, and it also meets the definition of security protection assets, for example. The scoping guide a little bit can give, in some cases, it'll say, hey, if there's a choice between these two things, pick this other one, right? Pick this one as a priority. In most cases, it doesn't give clarity. The assessors are going to generally take the highest requirement and apply it. So if you've got something that is both a CUI asset and it provides security functions to you, it's a security protection asset, we're going to feel the need to assess it against all level 2 security requirements because that's the higher one. So just be ready for that, okay? The one exception to that rule is when we are looking at this category called specialized assets, which are special types of assets that are unable to be fully secured. And they have much less assessment requirements, and they have much less requirements for security. If you can make the case that whatever you've got is a specialized asset, even if it stores, processes, or transmits CUI, right? Even if it's both this and this, we're going to say it's a specialized asset, and we're not going to assess it fully, because that's why we have this category, right? So we can't let CUI asset win, because otherwise there's no point of having the specialized asset category. Any thoughts, Mark?
I was just gonna say, we get much more in depth in the specialized assets. I believe it's video 8, but we as we break each of these down and discuss them like we did CUI assets today, you'll learn a lot more about how to determine if something's a specialized asset, which will of course then have that opportunity for you to make the logical decision and be prepared to argue your position, if you will, defend your position with an assessor who is preparing to assess your network.
So this is brought to you by CUI Solutions. We're an authorized C3PAO. We are doing assessments. We can also consult to help companies get ready with CMMC. Not the same thing for both companies, or actually not the same company for both things. Please like, subscribe, share. This content that we are giving you is normally paid content. Normally it's content that you have to pay a course to go learn. it might be several $1,000s for a week of training. So we're trying to raise awareness and help out the community so that as many companies can pass this assessment as possible on the first try. So help us get this information out there. All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everyone.